Wednesday, July 24th, Lethbridge, Alberta. Robert Kraychik reporting for Rebel News at the trial of Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek, which is nearing its end. Justice David Lebrans, the judge presiding over this trial, advised jurors today that he'll be providing them with their charge this coming Wednesday, which is a legal term for a series of instructions he provides them prior to their retirement to deliberate the verdicts for the charges against the two defendants. Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek are charged with conspiracy to murder. Specifically, the Crown is accusing the two men of conspiring to murder police officers during their time at the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade. That charge carries with it a potential life sentence. The two men are also charged with unlawful possession of a firearm and mischief over $5,000. Anthony Olenek is additionally charged with unlawful possession of an explosive device for a dangerous purpose. The two men have pled not guilty to all the charges against them, and recall that the Coutts protest and blockade, much like its sister demonstration in Ottawa, the Freedom Convoy, was this protest against what I refer to as the COVID-19 enterprise, this governmental apparatus of surveillance and control and coercion and censorship, all of these edicts and mandates and orders marketed to us by the government as some sort of public health measure to reduce COVID-19 transmission. This trial hit a milestone today, the conclusion of all evidentiary presentations. There's no more evidence to be shown to the jurors. Catherine Bayak, who is representing Chris Carbert, closed her case today. So what's outstanding? What remains to be done? The parties, prosecution and two defense attorneys, have to provide their closing arguments to the jurors, and then the different parties will have a sort of discussion and dispute over the language, the composition of a charge that will be provided to the jury by the judge. The charge is a legal term for a series of instructions the judge gives jurors before they retire to begin their deliberations. The judge, Justice David Lebrans, told jurors today that he will provide them their charge on Wednesday, and that the charge will take several hours to be provided to them, and at that point, they'll be sequestered to begin their deliberations. So the end is near. We finally heard the Crown's theory of the case articulated during today's proceedings, and it came out during lead prosecutor Stephen Johnston's cross-examination of Chris Carbert. I'll share some quotes with you folks that came from Johnston that illustrate this. Johnston told Carbert that Carbert believed that, quote, Coutts was going to be a launch pad for revolution. Johnston is mirroring and echoing arguments that we've seen from the U.S. government and politicians and subsidiary media, framing the protesters and rioters from January 6, 2020 in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol as being terroristically motivated and seeking to usurp democracy and essentially being engaged in sedition. Johnston also told Carbert, quote, you and your friends were prepared to use violence to repel the police in the event that police used force to, as Johnston put it, enforce the law to end the blockade. Johnston also said that Carbert viewed the RCMP as, quote, the devil, and, quote, they were the enemy. He's drawing that from a text that was taken from Carbert's phone that was composed by Carbert during the Coutts protest, in which he described the RCMP as the enemy. Johnston also said that Carbert viewed the entire protest as, quote, a final stand for what you believe were your freedoms. Catherine Bayak, defense counsel for Chris Carbert, invited a man named James Paul Kelly to testify as a witness today. Kelly is a former employee of Chris Carbert's, also a former roommate of Chris Carbert's, and he described himself as a friend of Chris Carbert's and Chris Carbert's family. And with that disclosure out of the way, his testimony focused on one thing, that he was at Chris Carbert's residence during the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade, given that he was his roommate at the time, and that some man who we later found out is Jerry Morin came to Chris Carbert's home to pick up some items that Chris Carbert had requested be picked up for him and delivered to him at Coutts, where he was attending the protest and blockade. And these items were basically clothing, socks, underwear, things of this nature. Kelly testified to that, given that he packed this bag, this care package, as it were, to be given to Jerry Morin to be delivered to Chris Carbard. Now, why is this important? Because the Crown has argued that this delivery, this package, was firearms. So Kelly's testimony directly contradicted that claim. The Crown's theory of the case, its allegation that Chris Carbard and Anthony Olenek conspired to murder police officers, is based on a contingency. In other words, the Crown is alleging that the two defendants plotted to murder police officers in the event that something would happen, that something being the use of violent force from law enforcement in order to put down and end the blockade, the demonstration at Coutts. The Crown is alleging that Carbard and Olenek were going to murder police officers in response to that hypothetical possible scenario. During his cross-examination of Chris Carbard, lead prosecutor Stephen Johnston asked the defendant about several texts that he had sent from his mobile phone during his time at the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade. These texts involved disparagement of certain police officers at the Coutts protest and blockade. Chris Carbard had described several police officers as losers and as the enemy. And Johnston sought to contrast these statements against something that Chris Carbard had said in previous testimony, where he sort of expressed reverence for law enforcement, describing them as heroes of Western culture. Chris Carbard basically withdrew those statements and said he regretted making them. Here's the quote. "Sometimes we say dumb things. I admit that. I acknowledge that. I am just a human being." Rebel News had reporters at the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade. We've been covering this since day one. Fast forward to Lethbridge, Alberta. Here I am, July 2024, and we're still deeply invested in reporting on the trials that flowed from this protest. And remember that this investment comes with a cost, and that's where our beloved and beautiful audience comes in. Your contributions, your donations allow us to continue with this journalistic enterprise that no one else can do. So please help us out. Visit truckertrial.com and stay up to date with our ongoing coverage.